In the town of Lucca, in 56 BC, Pompeius Magnus had negotiated his election to the 55 BC consulship by promising Caesar that he would extend his governorship of Gaul by another 5 years. Pompeius also negotiated for himself a 5-year term as proconsul of the Hispanias, and though he was forced to share his 55 BC consulship with his nemesis Marcus Licinius Crassus, who had made his own arrangements with Caesar, everything went according to plan. Caesar's tribune of the plebs, Gaius Trebonius, had legislated the Lex Tribonia, granting Pompeius a 5-year proconsulship in Hispania and Crassus a 5-year proconsulship in Syria, each with the right to unilaterally wage war without consulting the Senate. In exchange, Pompeius and Crassus had legislated the Lex Pompeia Lucinia, extending Caesar's already 5-year proconsulship of Gaul by another 5 years. Caesar stayed in Gaul, and Crassus left for Syria. Pompeius, however, sending deputies to govern in his name, chose to remain just outside Rome's sacred border. Even if Caesar pacified all of Gaul and Crassus defeated Parthia, their accomplishments could never compare to Pompeius's stellar military record. At the age of about 23, during Rome's first civil war, Pompeius had defeated 3 seasoned Marian commanders simultaneously. He fought under Sulla at the Battle of Colline Gate and then defeated the Marian resistance in Sicily and Africa. After the death of the dictator Sulla, Pompeius put down the rebellion of Marcus Aemilius Lepidus and then went to Hispania to take down the last Marian, Quintus Sertorius. In his conquest of the East, Pompeius had not only defeated kings Tigranes of Armenia and Mithridates of Pontus, but had conquered more than a dozen more kingdoms as well. Rome's Alexander the Great is what they called Pompeius Magnus. Against Caesar and Crassus, he had nothing further to prove. But by joining the alliance with Caesar and Crassus, known as the First Triumvirate, Pompeius had found the ratification of his eastern settlements, so tied up with Caesar's illegal legislation that he was obliged to uphold Caesar's laws. To undo Caesar's legislation would be to undo his own legislation and earn the enmity of his legions, thousands of soldiers who relied on his legislation, which granted them land. Pompeius's alliance with Caesar had cost him conservative support within the Senate, and though Marcus Porcius Cato and the other ultra-conservatives who called themselves the Boni had never supported Pompeius, he had the majority of the Senate's moderate conservatives behind him, until Caesar. Now, with both Caesar and Crassus gone, Pompeius could work on a solution to disassociate himself from Caesar's negative publicity. The office of dictator could provide that solution. The city of Rome was in utter chaos. Violence between Rome's opposing factions was erupting everywhere. The reformers, led by Publius Clodius Pulcher, whose activities were discreetly funded by Marcus Licinius Crassus and supported by Julius Caesar, battled the conservatives, led by Titus Annius Milo, under the protection of Pompeius Magnus and many Senate conservatives. Fighting took place in the streets on a daily basis, with corpses left lying in alleys and floating in the Tiber River. The Roman people, who lived in the thick of the violence, were already calling for a dictator. Pompeius just needed the Senate to agree and pass a vote naming him to the office. The dictator's word was law. As dictator, Pompeius could then repeal the illegal legislation of Caesar and then re-legislate separately the ratification of his eastern settlements. The Senate would be happy to have Caesar's land reform bill repealed, and Pompeius's veterans, secure on their land, would remain loyal forever. With a dictatorship in mind, Pompeius threw his support behind an old ally, Marcus Aemilius Scaurus. Following the conclusion of his propraetorship of Sardinia in 54 BC, Scaurus returned to Rome, intending to run for the 53 BC consulship. He was the brother of Pompeius's second wife, Aemilia Scora, and had served as quaestor to Pompeius during his eastern campaign. As consul, Scaurus could help bring the Senate to a vote which would see Pompeius elected dictator. Unfortunately, a group of Sardinian nobles also arrived in Rome, charging Marcus Aemilius Scaurus with plundering Sardinia, and they had a very strong case. Everyone knew that. As aedile, Scaurus had brought himself to financial ruin by putting on lavishly expensive games for the people of Rome. He had departed for his province utterly broke. Now returned from Sardinia, he suddenly had the necessary funds to run for the consulship. The trial of Marcus Aemilius Scaurus would last throughout the time allotted for consular campaigning elections, which normally took place in July. Having an indictment against him disqualified Scaurus from running for election until his innocence was established, which would not happen before election day. Suddenly, just before it was time for candidates to announce themselves and begin campaigning for the elections, both of the 54 BC consuls, Lucius Domitius Aenobarbus and Appius Claudius Pulcher, were caught in a scandal. Two consul candidates, Gnaeus Domitius Calvinus and Gaius Memmius, had placed 40 million sesterces in a trust to be paid to the consuls upon their elections to the 53 BC consulships. Gaius Memmius was the nephew of Pompeius Magnus, born to his sister. Interestingly, it was Gaius Memmius himself who went to the Senate and revealed his role in the entire scheme, betraying everyone else involved. Pending a thorough investigation into allegations that the consuls were selling offices, the elections for the 53 BC consulships were postponed. Amidst the scandal of electoral corruption and senatorial bribery, Pompeius Magnus's wife Julia, the daughter of Caesar, died from complications during childbirth. She had miscarried the previous year and never fully recovered before becoming pregnant again. Despite the way Pompeius Magnus felt about the complicated relationship he shared with his father-in-law, he was deeply grieved at the death of Julia, removing himself from public life to grieve privately. Pompeius wanted to place the ashes of Julia on his estate in the Alban Hills. Given that Pompeius owned several estates around Italy, his Alban Hills estate may have been Julia's favourite, prompting him to make the choice. The Roman people, however, loved Julia dearly and felt she belonged to all of Rome. They petitioned the Senate to enact a special decree allowing her remains to be interred on the Campus Martius. The consul, Lucius Domitius Aenobarbus, who despised both Caesar and Pompeius, tried to block the decree, but the will of the people prevailed. The Senate voted Julia a burial place on Rome's Field of Mars. As Pompeius mourned the loss of his wife, the investigation into the consular corruption continued to scandalize Rome. Priests were alleged to have perjured themselves, and provincial records were doctored in an attempt to justify the transfer of 40 million sesterces. Some sources claim that the consuls accepted the bribe, not so much for the money, but to ensure Scaurus, who was Pompeius's man, did not acquire the consulship, and then pushed to give Pompeius the dictatorship. Other sources claim it had something to do with Appius Claudius Pulcher, who was the elder brother of gang leader Publius Clodius, attempting to procure the governorship of Cilicia for himself, so that he and his other brother, Gaius Claudius Pulcher, who governed Asia, could together control the majority of Anatolia. To defend Scaurus, Pompeius turned one of his lapdogs, Marcus Tullius Cicero, whose actions had at one time made him father of the Republic, but who had subsequently been exiled for those same actions by the legislations of Publius Clodius. Owing his return from exile to the machinations of Pompeius Magnus, Cicero found himself paying for the favour many times over. Not only had Cicero coerced another special command for Pompeius from the Senate, but he was asked to refrain from prosecuting a personal enemy in the courts. Then, to add insult to injury, Pompeius railroaded Cicero into defending the same enemy when he was brought to trial a second time. Now, Cicero was expected to procure an acquittal for someone, despite their obvious guilt, simply because he was a useful puppet for Pompeius Magnus. Once Marcus Aemilius Scaurus was acquitted, the investigation into the consular elections also ended. Marcus Aemilius Scaurus, who had been so broke before leaving for Sardinia, announced his candidacy for the 53 BC consulship and began spreading massive amounts of largesse. But Publius Clodius, who did not want to see Pompeius named dictator, used his street gangs to continue holding up the elections, making every attempt to prevent Scaurus winning the consulship. Finally, in the face of scandal and the increasing street violence, the consular elections were held near the end of 54 BC. Despite being named in the scandal, Gnaeus Domitius Calvinus was elected consul alongside Marcus Valerius Messala Rufus, neither of whom, owing their loyalty to Caesar, would be likely to persuade the Senate to grant Pompeius Magnus the dictatorship. But there was always next year.